Hello and welcome to Moretospacethanair with Ayomide Fejidemoli. Today I have with me Antonio Stark, who is a South Korean-born, globally educated space policy and strategy consultant. Antonio has a wide background in entrepreneurship and technology, including working at global firms of SoftBank and Unilever, as well as deep tech startups and as a policy consultant for Asia Pacific governments. Antonio works closely with NGOs in the space sectors, serving as the Asia Pacific Regional Coordinator for Space Generation Advisory Council, East Asia Regional Coordinator for Moon Village Association, and Operations and Strategy Officer for Space Corps Foundation. His work in cislunar robotics, satellite platform and utilization, and international cooperation was recognized in multiple awards, including the Emerging Space Leader Award by the International Astronautical Federation, the Young Talent Award by the Asia Pacific Satellite Communications Council, and the Pioneer Award by SGAC. Antonio is also an avid adventurer, having gone on expeditions to the Himalayan mountain ranges and the Arctic Circle, scuba dived between tectonic plates at Iceland, and cycling through the Taiwanese East Coast. He loves communicating with fellow space people such as myself. So Antonio, thank you so much for joining me today. It's a pleasure to have you. Can you please introduce yourself and lead us through your career in space and any other interesting thing you might want to share?
Sure. I did give you a long bio, so I don't want to say much more about myself. But yes, my key point of expertise is in space policy and space strategy. And right now, the projects that I'm involved in are cislunar governance and robotics. So just working on what that means is basically just lunar infrastructure, including things like robots on the moon, or infrastructure that means just like construction on the moon, and like system engineering for human spaceflight onto the moon, and like how they will live and sustain life. Those kind of things are the ones that I'm involved in, and has been my passion for the last 3 years. And before that, it's been more generally space strategy and governance, because as you already gave a good explanation in my bio, I've been involved in a lot of technology and governance and policy things. So it's been just, the ideal way for me to kind of merge those thoughts together, merge those expertise, and provide good services for industry and the public sector.
Wow, that's so awesome. But what does it mean to be a space policy consultant?
Space policy was a field that wasn't much explored, I would say 10 years ago, and it has become a lot more interesting since the new space era. So new space is a word that's thrown out a lot, and it basically means there's a lot more emerging entities and actors that is being involved in the space industry. It means both governments, so China, India, are big countries who are now becoming a lot more actively involved in the space sector, but also smaller countries like Luxembourg, Thailand, Indonesia, that's utilizing their niche areas to be more involved in the global space community, as well as industry, academia, research institutes, think tanks that are all doing a lot of different work in the space sector. That's only happening because the space community is becoming a lot more interconnected. Like before, you only had the leading or the what we call spacefaring nations like Russia, United States, Japan, the member nations of the European Space Agency, and most notably France and Germany, who's been able to do a lot of things. But nowadays you have companies like SpaceX with its own mega constellation Planet, Amazon with its Kuiper satellites, and a lot of other smaller companies that in a single company can do a lot more than what governments used to be able to do before. So that's basically new space and space policy is a rising figure, because before all you needed to do was just talk to the big governments and they were like the only players. But nowadays, if you want to launch something, you need to make sure about a lot of different things. Like you might have, for example, Thai satellite that's been manufactured in South Korea, that has been funded through grant programs in Luxembourg, that is being operated out of, I don't know, that is being operated out of UK, but has been launched through the Indian rockets, and trying to go through and ensure that it adheres to all the different regulations and policies through all of those countries is where space policy is becoming very important. And it's important in the planning sector, in just planning if this is going to be feasible and if it's going to be cost efficient, but also goes over to the operating side of things, because if you have any data links that you want to do, if you want to transfer ownership of different assets in space, how would you go about doing that? Or even if you're not even doing any of that, just tracking different satellites, tracking different assets up there, and how to actually allocate bandwidth, or ensuring that your satellite or space assets, as we call it, is being managed and maintained properly by different regulatory bodies. That all goes under the purview of space policy. And as you can see from my example, it's a very wide field. It has so many different subsections that requires a lot of expertise. So you would see a lot of different space policy experts in different sectors, different countries, that is working on totally different things, but is still connected at some level.
Wow, that is very rich. Thank you so much, Antonio. You mentioned your work in cislunar robotics, and I wanted to follow up with you on how you would define your role in the industry, and perhaps who you would consider the major players, and how does your role interact with them?
Right. So cislunar robotics is, again, one of the many industry areas, is one of the many areas that industry is strong at. So you would hear a lot about, I mean, in the space policy people, you hear a lot about what you could or could not do on the moon, but honestly, there's not so much of a consensus in there. There's only like the Outer Space Treaty and a few other treaties that actually dictates what you can and cannot do, but they're still vague because it was all written back in the time when governments were the primary actors, and they didn't really think about how industry would go about. And the purview, I mean, the general guideline is that government should be responsible for keeping track of whatever the companies that is operating out of their government is adhering to the guidelines outlined. But again, the guidelines are already vague, and the whole point of what is the limit of a company operating out of it is like a company that is being funded by the government, a company that's illegally there, et cetera, et cetera. There are legal definitions, but trying to actually practically implement them, regulate them is a whole different issue. So industry is where you kind of care about it, but you don't really care about it too much, because there's nothing a lot of governments can do about it. Like there's as much debate surrounding what governments and regulatory bodies can do and should do versus what companies can actually achieve. So right now you're seeing a lot of different companies just going and sending things to the moon. For example, you had the Space IL project by Israel that had the frozen water bears that crash landed into the moon, that could have been a potential disaster for planetary, to ensure that no like alien life form would be contaminated by Earth life form, etc. And that wasn't notified before, but still the company did it because it didn't necessarily request for approval about that. It just went ahead and did it. And cislunar robotics is kind of like in the similar sphere. Can you excavate resources from the moon? Can you actually process it? Can you sell it? It's all like legal definitions of what you can and cannot do are out there, but most importantly for industry is, can you actually do it? Is it technically feasible? And that's the area where I'm involved right now. I'm trying to make sure that, can we do ISRU in situ resource utilization on the moon? and what are the technologies that are required to do that, especially using robotics? What are the communication redundancies? What are the AI specialties that they require? And if we do use AI for operating, what are the can and cannot do? And how much of a human commitment do we need? Human commitment from Earth by network stations or from orbiting stations around the moon, etc. So those are the areas that I'm exploring right now in my role.
And that's very interesting. You mentioned quite a lot of things, and from what I could get, most of the current projects you're on needs some certain level of competency. So my next question to you is, how were you able to build competency? More especially on how you were able to transition into this role, and perhaps if you want to share the challenges that have been peculiar to your entrance into the industry, and any other advice to young professionals who are currently looking toward the same path.
Right. So it does depend on what you want to do in the space industry. There are some very specific sectors in space where you just need to gain a lot of credentials. Like if you want to be a space surgeon or space medicine, you kind of need to take a certain track. But for space policy, it was a new field. It wasn't really mature at the time when I entered the field. And I happened to stumble upon it because I was doing a lot of policy work, but I also had a very deep background in space engineering systems. Also, I had a lot of experience in providing strategy consultancy for companies, especially global companies, in operating in areas that are outside their home country jurisdiction. So I was able to just merge all those things together, and the job that I landed was in the space policy sector. And there's a lot of jobs like this that will come up in the future. Things about mega constellations. Mega constellation didn't even exist a few years ago. So things about mega constellation sustainability, deorbiting, space traffic management, or space debris management, active space debris removal. These are all very, very new fields, and people can't really tell you what you kind of need to do because there's not many jobs existing right now. So whatever area you're passionate in, continue down that path, but always keep an eye out for space and how your expertise might be able to connect with it. For me, my project management skills as well as legal and policy background helped me get an entry here. And for my current role in strategy industry consulting, my previous roles in industry consulting really helped. But there might be other members out there in the audience who's more interested in medicine or robotics or propulsion engineering or systems engineering or even arts. Especially if you ask people right now, a lot of people want to be astronaut. How do you want to be an astronaut? There's literally no answer. Like private astronaut is a completely new field. We have no idea how you might become a private astronaut. Just do what you want. Maybe you get to be a pilot astronaut, maybe you get to be a systems engineer, maybe you can be a space tourism manager astronaut, etc., etc. Follow down the path that you want, but right now the industry is expanding so fast that you should be able to find some connection point that will bring you into the space sector.
And I will let you talk more on that. If you'd like to, please give us your concluding remarks.
Right. So if you're listening to this, you're obviously very interested in space already. So I don't need to say anything about that. But just make sure that you keep your options open. And I would say try to get into as many venues as possible. So the greatest help that I got was attending conferences and expos, because that's where all the new things were happening and the new research was happening. That's how I got to be involved in so many frontier industries before they got into the news, by simply being there and seeing people. And honestly, because there's not so many forums out there that's even discussing this online, it's really helpful if you get to attend these conferences and see the people, meet the people, discuss things with them, and that'll get you entry into organizations and different committees where you can work in. There are a lot of and of course, I'm also assuming a lot of the people listening to this will be coming from emerging countries or be from backgrounds where you're not able to fund yourself to these conferences, there's a lot of organizations out there that provide funding. Space Journalist and Advisory Council provides so many scholarships, but other organizations that I'm part of, such as Moon Village Association, as well as Space Corps Foundation, also has their own programs, internships that gives you entry. And there's a lot more organizations out there if you look into it, like Space for Humanity, World Space Week Association, Conrad Foundation, Students for the Exploration and Development of Space, SEDS. Go out there, look them up, find ways to make yourself involved, and I think that will really help your career.
Thank you so much for that list. I will put up the links so people can easily access them. Also, if people wanted to connect with you, how can they do that?
So as I mentioned, I'm very much active on Instagram and LinkedIn. So just find me on either platforms. On Instagram is Antonio F. Stark, because my full name is Antonio Fowler Stark. In LinkedIn is literally Antonio Fowler Stark, like all connected.
Awesome. Thank you so much for making time out to speak with me today. From us at Moretospacethanair, we'd like to show our sincere appreciation for your indulgence in the time zones. Thank you so much for that, and have a good one.